Today we sit with Guru Sethupathy. He started out as an investment banking analyst at JP Morgan, went on to get his PhD at Columbia. From there was a professor at Johns Hopkins for a few years. Later he was a consultant at McKinsey. He spent 6 years as a senior executive at Capital One and various lending businesses. And now he helps companies solve AI governance as founder and CEO of FairNow. FairNow describes themselves as an all-in-one AI governance platform that simplifies and centralizes AI risk management at scale. Let's jump into the discussion with Guru. Guru, good morning. It's great to see you again.
Hey man, great to see you, Carlos. Look forward to chatting the next half an hour.
Yeah. Last time we had dinner in McLean a few months ago. And then before that, I'd have to zoom it all the way back to 2004, 2005. We were both first years at Columbia. We were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed seeking our PhDs. You followed through. You ended up as a professor, ended up in the business world. Now you're a tech founder. I pivoted early and left the whole PhD world and went straight into consumer lending. And now our paths are crossing again. So this is exciting for me. But walk us through that journey. What led to kind of the academic to back in the business world to now building a tech business?
Yeah, I remember it had been a long time since we hung out, but I remember hanging out and you were teaching me how to play poker back in the day, Carlos. You remember that?
And I haven't stopped playing poker, Guru. So
We got to talk about that
you
at
can
some
count
point.
on that.
But your point, I actually want to connect the dots here. Like your point around like, hey, we're kind of now back again in similar spaces. Part of my career, one of the initial insights I had early on in my career, Carlos, is that life is long and careers are long. And so I developed this plan kind of early on. It was kind of this hazy plan back then. And it seems kind of ridiculous that a 25-year-old would think this way. But I felt, one, careers are long, life is long. And I didn't feel like there was one thing that was going to capture my attention for 50 years. The classic kind of paradigm of, hey, you go work at a company in an industry for your whole career seems silly to me. And then I thought more and more about like, hey, what's the most interesting thing that what are the interesting things we can do, right? If you do a thought experiment, Carlos, if you and I were born in 1400 Europe or, 2000 years ago in the Middle East or 5,000 years ago in Egypt, like we'd be doing very different things than we are now, right? And so we're you're a product of like what's the time and the place you're born and what's interesting about America in the 21st century. And for me, there were three things that I was like, hey, I got to experience these things, right? And so to me, academia and higher education, the US is unparalleled in the history of humanity, right? I'm like, that is a thing to go do. The second thing was Fortune 100 companies. The scale and size of Fortune 100 companies in the world, and especially in America, I mean, Amazon has more than 1 million employees. How do you run a ship with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people? And how do you, think through strategy and operationalize that and execute that and get all these people rowing in the same direction? I mean, the scale of our companies, our biggest companies, is just tremendous, and the impact that they have. And then third is innovation. Our technology sector, our innovation sector, our entrepreneurial sector. To me, those three things were kind of the things to do, the equivalent of being a knight, so to speak, in the time of Sir Arthur or whatever you want to say, right? So the three most interesting things one could do. And so that's kind of the journey. And that's how I ended up kind of doing the things that you mentioned in the lead off, right? Started my career in academia, loved it. But then, not enough to do it for 50 years, right? Like I thought. And so spent the last decade at McKinsey and Capital One, kind of either advising Fortune 100 companies or kind of rose up to be a leader within a Fortune 100 company. And then now kind of the third leg of this relay race, so to speak, and have started my entrepreneurial journey. So yeah, excited to talk to you about that.
That's awesome. So your company, FairNow, you focus on AI governance. When was the moment you thought you were onto something? And help us define AI governance. Like, what is that? Who's it for?
Yeah.
What problem do you solve?
Yeah. I think there's two moments I'll describe. One is like the initial idea, right? And the initial idea came about when I was actually at Capital One. And I know, Carlos, we share that in common too. We have Columbia and the PhD, and then Capital One, though I don't think we overlapped at the same times. I think I just missed you. But while I was there, I was leading kind of, data scientists, and I had AI, aspects of AI under my shop. And we had to do a lot of model risk management. And Capital One, right?
Mhm.
Like they take model risk management very seriously, and it's very thorough, but it's also painful. right? It's a lot of work. It's a lot of time of like very expensive resources, data scientists and others. And so one thought, the two thoughts I had was, look, AI, I've been long bullish on AI. And so this is before ChatGPT and anything like that, right? Like long bullish on AI, realizing governance was necessary. Like everyone's going to be using AI, but governance is going to be necessary. But we got to, it's painful. We got to find a way to simplify governance. And so that was one moment, initial moment of like, God, I wish I had a product that would simplify my life, that would simplify my team's life, right? And so that was the initial genesis of kind of how FairNow even got started. And so we actually have a bunch of X Capital One and X Financial Services folks on our team, because I think anyone in financial services, especially at a medium to larger bank that does risk management, gets that pain point. And then the second realization is more recently, we've started to gain some traction, right? And so just starting to realize like, yeah, the hypothesis that we had is the world is starting to catch up with that,
Mm.
right? And so whether it's kind of all the new laws and regulations starting to go into effect, whether it's just the increased kind of scrutiny just in the world, right? Even put aside regulations, just consumers, enterprise, stakeholders just being like, hey, this AI stuff is really interesting, but can we trust it? The number one reason for hesitancy around adoption of AI, Carlos, is worries about risk, right? So all of that. So that hypothesis we feel is starting to like pick up now, and we think it's only going to grow from here on out.
Got it. So when I think AI governance, my mind goes to two things. The first is, do I understand what the models are doing? Can I explain it? Does it kind of make intuitive sense? And I'm thinking there as kind of a risk manager putting a model into the market. And then the second thing I think about is it compliant with all the lending laws and regulations? Are those the two right buckets? Is there other buckets? Like how would you categorize what you mean by AI governance?
Yeah, those two, absolutely. I'd add a third. Okay. And that is process and procedures. And those are not sexy terms, but like it ends up being actually very important, right? But let's start with the order that you described. So monitoring is the first bucket. I'd put that under, right? So do you know what your AI is doing? Do you know what your and just to let me pull back even further. When I say AI, and I think you and I implicitly are on the same page here, but for your audience, we're talking about any model that takes data as an input, right? Does pattern recognition and processing and inference on that data to do anything from making predictions to recommendations to generating content to performing tasks, like anything, right? So it's not just Gen AI, right? So machine learning models have been around for a while. That also gets, a lot of them get classified as AI as well, right? So coming back, monitoring is key. Do you know what they're doing, right? Monitoring is straightforward. So how often are you monitoring them? On what dimensions are you monitoring? What are the controls, the thresholds that you have around monitoring where you're like, hey, red, yellow, green, like, yeah, green, everything's fine. Yellow, I need to check something. Red, hey, something's off, right? Like all of that is part and parcel. So explainability is one part of it, Carlos, for sure. Performance matters, bias matters, right? So there's multiple dimensions. And now with Gen AI, there's other things that matter, like data security and privacy and, so on, and, hallucinations and so on and so forth, right? So I put all that under the monitoring bucket, and explainability is an important piece, but not the only piece there. The second piece is about compliance, right? And so I know we were just talking about this before we got on the air, but for a lot of entrepreneurs and tech folks who are new to financial services, maybe, and haven't like spent years, steeped in fintech or financial services, it's a very regulated space, right? And so you got to know and understand what you're doing here and what might run afoul of those regulations or not, right? And a lot of these regulations are pre-AI, because you're just not supposed to discriminate or be biased regardless of who makes a decision. It doesn't matter if a human's making a decision, if your dog's making the decision, or the AI is making the decision, you can't be biased, right? But on top of that, there's standards like SR 11.7, for instance, that kind of walks through like, hey, what does good risk management look like when it comes to models? And then now there's new laws coming into play where lending is absolutely considered a high risk use case of AI technology, right? So you've got to be aware of these rules. And the third thing I would talk about is, what are your policies, procedures? Like, how do you govern it? Like if something does go wrong, what's your remediation plan? Who's ultimately accountable, right? What are your policies around this? What data would you use? What data would you not use about your customers, right? Like, so there's all these things kind of that you have to have guardrails around, that goes beyond compliance, because the laws don't actually get into that level of specifics. And so it's up to you to figure out, hey, what are your red lines? What are your processes? How will you remediate? What's your level of transparency? Those kinds of things. And what's your process, right? Like there's a as you know this code, there's a life cycle to models, from testing to deployment to kind of to turning it off. And so what does that process look like? Where are humans in the loop? So I would include that third bucket of like process also around governance as well.
Got it. Okay. I want to pause here for a second to tell you about one of our sponsors, Spinwheel. They've built an API that streamlines your lending application form with just 2 fields. When a customer shares just their birth date and phone number, they can go grab all the information needed to pre-fill their application form. So regardless of what channel you play in, you know that the higher the application rate goes, the lower your cost of acquisition becomes, and the more media you can buy to generate growth. Additionally, they can give you real-time verified consumer credit data and seamless payment processing, which can help you serve customers beyond the initial application. To see a demo, go to spinwheel.io or check out the link in the show notes. It'll hook you up straight with their head of growth. The clients I tend to work with, Series A, B, C type fintech lenders, I'm usually in, they usually pull me in the context of growth, customer acquisition, growth, partnerships, that sort of thing. I don't see AI governance as a hot button issue. At least it doesn't come up in my conversations. But contextualize for many of our listeners work at FinTechs. Why is this something they should be paying attention to?
Yeah. Look, I get the sentiment of cost centers, right? Trying to minimize costs and trying not to do things unless you absolutely have to, especially as right? I'm a startup, right? So if it's not affecting my top line today, why am I doing it, kind of thing, right? And I think there's 2 things to think about if you're in that stage, right? Series A to Series C, yes, early to mid stage startup, right, in the fintech space. One is just know that the scrutiny on AI is increasing, right? And again, when we talk about AI, it's not just Gen AI, though I'm sure they're starting to use Gen AI as well in these fintechs, but it's also just classical machine learning models, right? Is getting swept up into scrutiny. And so know that you're just, going to be in scope for these laws and regulations coming about. Now, at the end of the day, you might be willing to take that risk and say, hey, look, no one's really going to come after me. That's fine. But you should know that these laws are there now, they're getting passed, and you are almost definitely in scope if you're a fintech, right? So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is, even if you don't care, other people that you do care about do care. And so what I mean by that is, look, a lot of fintechs want to partner with banks for a multitude of reasons: access to customers, the asset base, blah, 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 right? Those sponsor banks are starting to care, right? And this is something they've kind of let slide for a while. In my conversations, they said, hey, we really haven't gone too deep with our fintech partners, but they are starting to get hit because they're bigger than you, right? They're bigger than fintechs. They are starting to come under the crosshairs. And just in the last, I would say, 18 months or so, you've seen more cease and desist orders. You've seen some more kind of supervisory orders as well, right? Like from the OCC and stuff like that coming after these sponsor banks, right? And some of it's just their own issues, but some of it is also related to, hey, you don't seem to know what you're doing with your partner technologies and tools, right? A lot of these banks, almost all their models come from their fintech partners, right? They don't have a huge data science team internally and all that kind of stuff. So for them, managing this AI governance is a new thing. And so in my conversations with them, Carlos, what I'm hearing is they are investing in this. They are investing. If they are investing in this, they're going to require some things from you, the fintech, right? And so you're going to see that start to flow downhill with the regulators putting pressure on them and therefore them having to put some pressure on you, right? Yeah. And so for both of those reasons, and especially as you grow as a fintech, right? Yeah, maybe seed stage, Series A, no one's paying attention, but you're Series C and you're growing into that. At some point, governance is going to become really important. And if you don't, it becomes actually existential. It's one of those things where it's fine, you're not paying attention, it's like our health, right? Like we're not paying attention. Then one day we're like, oh shit, I wish I paid attention to it. And so that's where I think, the fintechs that are growing are going to want to start to pay attention.
You're connecting their kind of governance and compliance to growth.
Yes.
And I felt that pain myself, having worked at, early stage fintech lenders.
Right.
And the way it manifested for me was, again, nobody paid attention. No one asked questions. It was something that just wasn't discussed internally.
Right.
Until a potentially very large partner
exactly.
was diligencing the company.
Exactly.
And wanted to open the hood specifically on that thing.
Exactly.
Right. And the moment that happened, it goes from this doesn't matter at all
to the most important thing.
To holy shit, it's the
important
thing that's holding back the company from growing.
Right. And you're seeing that in sales cycles, Carlos, where a lot of our customers are coming to us at that point where they're like, oh yeah, I have some customers. They have some customers who are asking the questions, and they're like, we need help. And then at that point, it goes from the lowest priority to the highest priority issue, because again, that's a revenue thing now. That's a sales cycle. And sales cycles are slowing down because of this, right? Or partnership cycles are slowing down because of this. And so at that point, because it becomes a top line issue, you will care. And so again, I get it for fintechs who are like, hey, this hasn't come up yet. But for them, I would just encourage, just stay abreast, understand what's going on, understand the landscape. So you're not completely caught off guard when when this happens. And when it does become an issue, come talk to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing I'll say there around, I think there's something to be said around don't solve a problem until it's a problem.
Right.
You as an entrepreneur, me as kind of a business owner, I think we both get that. However, back to that moment where the big partner is diligencing you and they have a question about your governance. If that's an oh shit moment for you, and you go ghost for 4 weeks because you're running around assembling a governance program that didn't exist,
Right.
guess what that signals to the partner?
You're not ready.
That signals these guys just made, like, whatever they're about to send me is made
They
up.
just made up.
Because if they had a program, they would have just sent it to me the next day, right? So like, I still think there's subtle things that you let off
Yeah.
if you do get caught unprepared.
On that point, though, I think you bring up a really good point, which is, and this is something we recommend, which is it's not an all or nothing. You don't need to go from 0 to 60 in a second, right? There's actually a light touch program you could have kind of earlier stage, which I think is actually also just good hygiene, right? You don't want to be taking on risks. You want to know where your risks are in the lending space and so on and so forth. And so that's something we can help folks with too, is like, hey, without going full board, like what does a light touch program look like for startups? And our platform really helps with that too, of like just implementing a very simple light touch program that kind of keeps your mind at ease, but also if that day comes, you already have something to be ready for that big customer that's coming down the pipe.
I love that. So you talk to a lot of executives about AI governance. What's a common misconception you keep hearing?
Yeah, it's exactly related to this point. Everyone thinks it's a cost center, and it is initially, right? It is initially, but the ROI on the top line is huge, right? And here's why, right? Again, I go back. The number one reason for AI adoption slowing right now is risk. People just don't know. This is such a new technology, it's such a powerful technology. And Carlos, I give a bunch of analogies on this, so hopefully your audience will appreciate this. Everyone, we all know about the automobile. Everyone drives, right? People, what they don't know is it took decades for the automobile to take off after it first got produced. And the initial reason was people were terrified of it. Risk. It was risk. Or why would I drive this death trap? And if I'm not going to go fast, then I might as well ride a horse, right? So you're in a catch-22. Like if I'm not going to, I'm too scared to use it properly. And if I'm not going to use it properly, I might as well use the existing technology. And so that's what you see in AI, where people aren't really harnessing the full potential of it yet because they're worried about the risk. But then, and then the value prop doesn't like ring up either. And so it took a while for regulations, right, from driver's licenses to speed limits to traffic cops to sensors and technologies and seatbelts and all that stuff to come, where now today we don't even think about it, right? But that's going to be the thing for actual adoption of AI to exponentialize. You're going to need governance to be an important part of the ecosystem. And so what I tell people, whether you're a large firm and internally you're trying to get stakeholders to get on board, whether it's risk, compliance, et cetera, or you're a small firm trying to sell and partner with others, it's going to start to become a friction. Governance is going to start to become a friction for adoption, for innovation, for revenue growth, all of those things that you expect from your AI. And so if you really want to maximize the power of this technology, you want to reduce that friction, governance is going to become a piece. So to me, that's the biggest kind of misconception of like, oh, it's this cost center, where it's actually, if you do it right and smart and like kind of the right size of it, like too much governance is annoying too, right? I get that. But if you right size it, it actually can have huge ROI to your top line.
Yeah, no, I can see it. And earlier you were talking about monitoring, and you mentioned the Capital One culture, which I was a part of for many years. And one of the things I got out of that monitoring exercise, there was something around the discipline of pre-deciding what you were going to look at, pre-deciding, and you mentioned yellow, green, red status on every metric, and then being vigilant around actually checking all those things and writing the memo and communicating that. There's something about that discipline that I think helps you catch operational errors and risky segments and a whole host of things that, you're putting this in the blanket of governance, but this is actually just great risk management. And if you're a fintech lender, you're in the business of great risk management, right? So
Yeah.
I think they kind of go hand in hand.
They go hand in hand. And I also talk about it as good hygiene, right? Like, not everything, it's actually quite nonlinear, right? If you have zero governance and you just implement just even a simple basic program, that reduces your risk drastically, right? Just know what's going on. Like you said, the simple monitoring, the simple documentation, so you have a trail. So if anyone ever asks, imagine someone asks and says, "Hey, do you have model cards that you automatically can give us?" Right? So we know what's going on. Imagine you have that, right? Like, it's not that hard. It's not a huge investment at all to have basic monitoring, a basic remediation plan, and documentation, right? It's like literally getting up and brushing your teeth and taking a shower. Like, yeah, you don't have to do that. It gets in the way of your startup. Sure, that could be an hour you're working, but man, that good hygiene is pretty good when you then have to, you're ready to go, a customer comes knocking on the door and you're showered and shaved and, ready to go, right? So just
Yeah.
like, again, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. There's a lot of kind of in between that gives you a lot of the bang for the buck in terms of what you need from a risk management standpoint and what customers and partners are going to be asking of you. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I want to hit on another thing you were talking about earlier. You were mentioning uh, kind of AI governance as a way to manage the regulatory environment and use the word bias. You got to make sure your lending models aren't biased for or against any protected class. Walk us through the regs there for a second. Like, what regs are we talking about, and what can and can't you do as it pertains to bias?
Yeah. So look, there's like the card, there's numerous regulations, right? There's the Card Act and there's kind of other laws around kind of lending and bias and anti-discriminatory rules in the lending space. On top of that, there's SR 11.7, which is a kind of a standard in the lending space. OCC partnering with kind of the private sector to kind of develop the standard around good habits around risk management, and of course, bias comes into play there quite a bit. And then on top of that, like, look, things like when you do a turn down to an applicant, right? You need to be able to explain that, right? Explainability comes into play there, right? Bias and explainability often go hand in hand, right? You have to know the reasons for why you're doing what you're doing. And then, of course, there's just kind of general business risk. There was a recent one, I think it was with LLMs, Carlos, where there was the spouse of a senior executive at a financial services company used the same information but could not get access to a credit card loan. And that went, made huge news in the front page, and it was all over the news. And it was just like, hey, these LLMs are biased, right? And so there's that full spectrum. It's everything from like there's actual laws and regulations, right, in the industry. And then now if you look at these new laws, so for instance, the EU AI Act. So if you're a European fintech player, or in America, you have Colorado with the biggest one out there, but California and then some other states now about to pass them as well. They're very clear. These are general AI laws, Carlos, but they specifically call out different risk tiers. And lending is in the high risk category for obvious reasons. The ones that often fall into high risk are things related to health and medical, lending and financial services and insurance, and hiring, right? So those are kind of all in the highest tier risks. And so any domains in those, any companies in those domains have to follow these new laws, right? So in addition to existing laws like the Card Act, you have to do these additional laws are coming into play as well. But again, I don't want to like underemphasize the business risk side of this too, right? Like, especially as a fintech, as a startup, if you ever get caught with some problems in your models, you're done, right? So again, that flip side is existential, right? If there is bias and and it comes out with a sponsor or with a partner or with customers, you're kind of done. How do you recover from that? Right. The business risk is pretty big too. So for both of those reasons, it becomes really important that you just, at least you should know what's going on in your technology.
Yeah, and you're hitting on also the something you mentioned earlier around explainability, and you connected it to, I think you were talking about adverse action reasons, right? You decline someone, you got to provide that reason. What are the other benefits of being buttoned down on explainability? Well, like, walk us through, I guess, from a risk management perspective. Let's step away from regs and like just hardcore compliance, but more from as a risk manager that builds models. Why is explainability important?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think explainability is important for a couple of reasons. From a risk management perspective, again, one, you're partnering with a bank, they're going to start to ask you this question. Can you explain decisions? Can you explain decisions both at kind of, hey, I just got audited, I need you to explain stuff, like at a tactical level, or two, hey, it's part of my risk management program, I need to ensure all the tech tools that I'm using through my vendors is explainable. So both at the tactical and the strategic level, your partners are going to start to expect that from you. And then customers do, right? Like, think about it, right? Like, that is something that's, again, part and parcel of not just regulations, but the customer experience. They want to know why they were declined for, whether for a credit card or for an extension of their credit limit or a variety of things. They want to know. It's part of your own, that's part of business risk management, right? Like, what kind of experience are you providing your customers? And it's table stakes these days, Carlos, to be able to provide an answer and an explanation for these things. So for both of those reasons, you want to know. And then the third is explainability ties to a bunch of other things, including performance, bias, and so on and so forth. So you, as a fintech leader, you want to know what your models are doing, because are they even performing as well as they could? Do you know that? How do you know that? What are your metrics? What are your trade-off curves, right? And if you don't know that, then you're not going to know if you're leaving money on the table from a revenue standpoint, from a execution standpoint, all those things. So I think for those three reasons, there's a kind of a compliance component to it, there's a business component to it, and then there's just an operations component to it, where you just want to know what's driving your outcomes, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
This is a quick plug here for my marketing agency. It's called New Market Growth. We do nothing but help fintech lenders accelerate their growth in affiliate marketing channels. Our services are both strategic and operational. And if you want to learn more about how we can help you, find us at newmarketgrowth.com or email me directly at carlos@newmarketgrowth.com.
Through the course of my business, my journeys in lending, here's how I normally have experienced this. There's a team of data scientists with piles of data, like just an incredible amount of information. They throw it into whether it's LLMs or some convoluted set of algorithms, and it spits out a score basically for every customer or potential customer. And then it rank orders, right? And then you build a chart that says, okay, here's the charge-off rate across. Let's make it simple, 10 deciles. And it's clear that, the first decile is the least risky, and as you go up, they get more risky. But if I start to ask the question, hey, explain the difference to me between decile 1 and 2, I get
Blank stares.
looks like I'm an alien. People, like, they don't even know where to begin. So walk me through, like, how does your product start to answer that question? Because it doesn't seem like a straightforward thing to put data to.
Yeah. Gosh, I can take this in so many directions, especially also our background as economists too, right? Like, the difference between kind of throwing a bunch of variables against a wall and seeing what sticks, and correlations and machine learning versus economics methodology and causality, and right, like, that's a whole conversation one could have, and I'll touch on that briefly. But what's interesting here, there's actually been a real flip in this industry, Carlos, over the last 2 decades, and let me talk you through that change. When it was used to be mostly human decision making, what you had was, I would argue, subpar human decision making, but incredible explainability. Right, because the human could just tell you, oh yeah, I declined Carlos because his income was whatever. Right, the explainability was amazing, but the decision making wasn't great because they were going off of terrible heuristics. Right, so we go from that to today's world where the analytics and the models are better than human decision making for sure, but the explainability is subpar now. Right, so we flipped the script a bit here. Right, and so all else equal, look, you'd still prefer a world with better decision making, even if it's subpar explainability. But explainability is kind of really important. We need to improve that. Look, there's some classic techniques, right? Like the Shapley value and techniques like that to be able to discern, hey, which variables and factors matter in a model. So those are some standard techniques that our team uses to be able to kind of hit on explainability and to simplify explainability in machine learning models. That being said, there are even better techniques, because even Shapley value gets at the importance of factors, but not the causality of factors, right? And so it becomes even more complicated to really determine what factor caused the outcome as opposed to was correlated with that outcome, and that, that can have different kind of implications. Then the complication gets even more intense when you're talking about LLMs, And some folks, again, I'm still more familiar in the world where it's mostly machine learning models that are being used in lending, but I know that's changing. I've heard and seen more people using LLMs in this world, and there the explainability goes to close to zero, right? Like we are not able to handle that. I don't know anybody who does have the capability to handle explainability in that context, and I would be wary of that. Again, lending's a very regulated space. Explainability does end up mattering, and LLMs, as far as I know, and Carlos, you tell me if you know any differently, but I don't know any like excellent techniques to be able to figure out what's going on in these really deep learning neural networks in these LLMs at this point. So that's a bit dicey.
Walk us through like that user interface. Let's say it's a machine learning model and it's spitting out an output, or it has a bunch of users that have been scored. Like, how does FairNow tell the lender, hey, here's what's actually going on. Here's the essence of the insights
Yeah, look,
underneath the
all we
model.
need are the inputs and the outputs, right? It's pretty cool that way, right? So what the key thing we need are kind of those scores, as you mentioned, and that can come in a variety of formats, right? It could be like you said, the decile rankings, or it could be more continuous variable scores, whatever kind of output that you have there. But then what we need are the features, right? What were the features? How are they used? And then we're able to, behind the scenes, be able to do this kind of shapely value analysis. And the point of the shapely value is basically able to tell you how important were you, right? And in a simple way, how important were you to the outcome here, right? Were you a key driver of the score, or were you not less important? And then aggregating that across thousands of customers, right? Like the sample size and all that starts to help. And then what we're able to do is, from a user experience, able to show that in different ways, right? It can be shown in graph form or table form. Graph is usually nice because you can really see kind of where the features start to matter more and what type of decisions and for what type of customer groups, right? For different customer groups, different decisions matter. So you can kind of show some pretty neat heat maps that way and stuff. So we're still playing around kind of like what's the right output that's most helpful for customers. But those are right. It's what we need is feature data and then candidate level data, especially inputs and outputs. And then that gets us to what we need to do.
You mentioned an idea I think wasn't intuitive to me, but you framed it as this isn't all or nothing. So, not the more I think about it, the more I think it makes sense. But if I was an early stage fintech, Series A, Series B, I have early stages of product market fit. I'm scaling, but I haven't really spent a bunch of time here. I may not even have an in-house counsel. Like I'm just kind of pretty early innings. Like what would you suggest be my roadmap for the next 12 months if I want to go from 0 to say point 0.1 or point 0.2? Like I want to lay some basic foundations. What would you suggest that I do?
Yeah, I would take it again. It's small approaches and small increments, right? And so if you're Series A at that point, look, my guess is it's a function of how complex your technology and your product is. How many models do you have, right? Do you just have like 5 models? Look, if you just have a couple of models, I would say, allocate a part of your data science team's time, right? You don't need someone like us. You don't need to go hire someone new. Just allocate some part of your data team's times to track these things, right? Like how many models do you have? What's the metadata around them? Just create some documentation. Just have a simple process, right? The key part there is make sure you are monitoring them though, right? And your data science, again, if you had data science internally, they should be able to do this themselves, right? So again, I wouldn't go heavy hog here. When you start to get more models and you're starting to like figure out partnerships with sponsor banks and you're starting to, really grow your kind of technology base, that's the point where you either kind of, hey, bring in someone part-time, or bring in someone part-time and use a platform like ours that kind of automates a bunch of that stuff for you, right? Automates some of the monitoring for you, automates some of the documentation creation for you, and just really simplifies it, right? And in fact, that's our value prop is for some of the smaller companies out there that don't want to go build a 4 or 5 person team for this. Can you do it with 1 person or half a person plus our platform? If you can do that, that's our value prop to you. Hey, we just saved you a bunch of stuff and still helped you manage that risk, right? So that's what I'd encourage is like, when you get to that point where you're like, I'm starting to think about governance. Okay, come to us. We'll save you from having to build out a multiple person team, and you can do it with like half a person and our platform.
And if I wanted to use your platform, like what would I need to do? Do I need to connect to like my enterprise data? Like what are the rails I need to build to make it useful?
Yeah, it depends on how you want to use it, right? Like we offer multiple options for our customers. Like if you want to make it as seamless as possible, right? Just be able to do everything by API, then there's going to be some integration required and stuff like that. If you're fine with other ways of like, hey, just uploading the data in a protected kind of cloud instance or whatever, then there's less integration that's involved, right? So it's really, we give options, especially in terms of, hey, do you care about an upfront fixed cost of integration or not? And if you don't care, hey, let's do the integration. If not, let's keep it simple, right? And so there's a couple different options there in terms of interacting with it. And the rest of the stuff is pretty straightforward, right? It doesn't require a whole lot of kind of training or use. You just kind of log in, it's a place to kind of document your things, store your metadata, and it kind of produces the requisite audit trail that you need. So that's the nice thing about it, right? It doesn't require a whole lot of setup costs.
Got it. So I've never seen the product in real life.
Oh, we got to
Maybe
find
one day
time
we
to
get
do
a
that.
demo.
Shoot, I didn't
Yeah.
even realize that.
Yeah, maybe
would-
one day we do a demo here.
Yeah,
I think that would
yeah.
be awesome. But
Yeah.
what I'm imagining is like what Salesforce does for like enterprise sales,
Yeah.
your product kind of does for like AI governance. Is that the right way to think? Is it like
Yeah.
purely SaaS, or is there other like consulting services that are attached to
We
it?
do provide some consulting, and we have partners that do consulting as well, right? Like we have auditors, for instance. That's another thing that as you scale more and more, you'll want to have a third-party audit on your models and stuff. So that might not be for your Series A companies, but if you're pre-IPO, that's another like target-rich environment for governance, right? Like when you're pre-IPO, like Series C, Series D, but you're thinking of IPOs on the horizon. You know this, Carlos. At that point, all the regulatory stuff becomes a thing, right? And you got to have your ducks in a row before you IPO. You're about to become a public company. Then it becomes a really big deal. And so, so we can connect you to auditors. We have, all of that capability. But look, again, the thing that we provide is we're tracking all the laws and regulations, so you don't have to. So it's able to automatically tell you, hey, for these models, these are the laws and scope, and these are the things you need to do. There's testing and explainability capabilities. And then, like I mentioned as well, the documentation. It's not going to automate documentation completely because you don't even want that. You need human review in the process, but it gets you halfway there. So imagine being able to automate kind of half of your documentation approximately, right? So that there, because what that sets you up for is if you ever get audited. If your sponsor bank partner ever asks for, hey, I need these documents ready to go, you're all set to go, right? So again, it simplifies that process for you so that one person can kind of manage this for you instead of needing a team of 3, 4, or 5 people.
Got it.
But yes, we should do that demo at some point.
Sorry, say that one more time.
No, but yes, we should get time to do that demo at some point. I didn't even
Oh
realize
no,
that.
I'd love to see it.
Yeah.
If I was a fintech founder,
Yeah.
and I've something about today's conversations got my attention, what would be some resources you would suggest for me to just get smarter on this domain?
Look, first of all, our website, right off our website, we have a bunch of documents and blog posts and instructions, right? We track all the laws. So there's a place there where we can just see kind of what laws are kind of coming down the pipe. We have written kind of some implications for FinTechs. And so we have blog posts, but we talk about kind of implications for financial services firms and FinTechs and so on and so forth. And then you can reach out to me, right? So www.fairnow.ai is our website. And my email is guru@fairnow.ai. And so if you want to talk more about this and just learn kind of, what's going on this topic and where you can get more resources, you can come talk to me as well.
Awesome. Guru, I enjoyed today's conversation. You were generous with your time and rich with insights as usual. So I appreciate you joining us today, and I'll hold you to that demo. I'd love to see it sometime.
Hey, thanks for having me. Hopefully this was interesting and informative for folks. And even if they're early on in their journey, at some point, this is going to become a topic that they're going to be thinking about. And at that point, hopefully this podcast will be something on their mind that they can come back to refer to. And you or I can help them along the way, Carlos.
That sounds
Thanks
good,
for having
Guru.
me.
All
Appreciate
right.
it.
Well, we'll talk soon, my friends.
All right.
If you want to support the show, the number one thing you can do is go to thefreetoaster.com and sign up for our newsletter. You're going to get a couple pieces per week of news, information, insights, and podcasts like the one you're listening to right now at the intersection of marketing, lending, and technology. That's our niche. We don't plan to go outside of that. It's the only publication I've seen out there on the internet that dials into this zone. So if you want to support us, sign up and share it in your favorite Slack channel.